Hey everyone, how's it going? It's your boy Skilled Fawn, and today we're going to be doing an Elden Ring challenge run. Let's waste no time and get straight into the rules. Starting off, we can only use the Scarlet Rot status effect. Like I did previously with the status only runs, weapon must have the status effect beforehand. Next, no spirit summons. Though there are some spirit summons that apply rot, I want to just test myself. This way things will be more clear. If you want to see spirit summons in my runs, check out the Deathblight and Madness only runs where I use summons that fit the theme. Subsequently, I must beat the game and DLC. Afterwards, I must defeat all remembrance bosses. I cannot use armor. Previously, I gave an exception for Rykard, but let's see if we can actually get past him with no armor. If so, this and other runs in the future will officially be no armor. Lastly, glitches and or exploits are allowed, so expect some cheeky ways to get around areas and take down bosses. I'm excited to share this run with everyone. Make sure to smash that like button, comment, and subscribe to help support me in the channel. Hit the bell icon to be notified when I post similar challenges. Now, let's get into the run. Talking to Melina, we get Torn. Afterwards, we grab both of the Dectus medallions. This makes accessing Altus Plateau slightly easier. While I was in Caelid grabbing the second half of the medallion, I thought it would be a good idea to also do the Commander O'Neill cheese. This way I will have some runes to my name and can also level up some stats. Beside the Shaded Castle, we find an NPC who has a rot weapon. It is interesting that there isn't a weapon in Caelid that the player can grab. Instead, it's next to Mount Gelmir. Because we still don't have a weapon, I want to try gravity cheesing the NPC. Surprisingly, it worked really well, and I ended up getting it the first try. Subsequently, we do a nice cavalry cheese, and also take down Bernal. This way we collect some easy runes alongside getting the Blasphemous Claw before taking down Rykard. Next we head into Castle Stormvale and take on Margit the Fell Omen and Godric the Grafted. Rot was really helpful in these fights, especially since the weapon I'm using is unupgraded. While it did take some time to build up, it was great seeing these bosses take continuous damage. Margit will yield another talisman slot, and Godric will give a fair amount of runes, alongside collecting his great rune. Eventually, we take these fools down. Because we went into Altus previously, this allows us to enter General Radahn's festival and take him on. Entering his fight, I always like to do the exploit to make him come towards me. This makes things much more manageable. Radahn is super easy to rot, so building it up on him wasn't something I was worried about. Timing our attacks to not get punished, dodging his attacks, especially that insane phase 2 move, and managing our stamina, we take down Star Scourge Radahn. This is such an awesome boss fight, and I'm always super pumped to fight him beforehand. Entering Lindell, we grab the various Smithing Stone bell bearings, then backtrack to Liurnia to take down Rennala. After some time going through the capital and the lands between, we come across Morgoth the Omen King. This boss has grown on me with each playthrough, and I find his fight extremely enjoyable for his relatively fast-paced combat. Rot was fairly useful in this fight, but especially during his phase 2 transition when I wasn't able to attack him. Ultimately, we take down the Omen King and are halfway through the main game. Going into Mountaintops of the Giants, we grab the third Smithing Stone bell bearing. Next, we blaze through Fire Giant's fight. While the fight is going on, let's talk about Scarlet Rot and our findings so far. Rot is a much better poison, with it lasting longer, and more enemies being weak to it compared to other status effects. So far, I think this is a good status effect, but ultimately, where does it stand in comparison to the others? Let me know down below. Do you think Rot is good, or do you think it's not worth it? I'm curious to hear. Teleporting to Farum Azula, we fight Godskin Duo and Malekith the Black Blade. I always enjoy coming to Farum Azula, except for those cursed birds in between these boss fights. I prefer the parry strategy using the Buckler Shield for the Godskins and the Blasphemous Claw for Malekith. This way I can get a ton of easy damage once I time the parries correctly. I think Malekith is such an insanely cool boss, and it helps that he nearly destroys every other boss in this game. Grabbing the Erdtree medallions, we go to Consecrated Snowfields and take on this duelist. On defeat, this guy will drop our next rot weapon. Another awesome fight is Godfrey First Elden Lord. Because we defeated Malekith and Farum Azula, this transforms the capital into ash. Here we find some new bosses and the endgame boss fights. For now though, we take on Godfrey. I found this axe to be insanely fun to use, and the poise damage it dealt was on another level. Rot was pretty average in this fight. Wasn't the most helpful, but definitely wasn't useless like Madness or Deathblight. Ultimately, we take down Godfrey. The next two bosses are Radagon and Elden Beast. I was genuinely surprised on the last challenge run when I was able to poison proc Radagon, since I thought he could only be frosted. I talked about this more than a few times over, the course of the challenge runs I do, but I really do mean that each time I play one of these Soulsborne games, it makes me a better player, and I've become much more knowledgeable about the world progression, items, etc. This is one of the many examples, but it's definitely important to note. And this is definitely one thing I'm sure you guys notice whenever you guys play, is you guys get better each time you play and, learn something new. Though Radagon can be rotted, Elden Beast cannot, so we just had to use pure physical damage. The axe was awesome because it allowed me to get a ton of damage whenever I staggered it. After some time though, we take these fools down. We claim the Elden Throne as our own, and so now let's defeat the remaining bosses before heading into the DLC. Next, we do a boss gauntlet on a bunch of remembrance bosses. Moog the Omen and Melania Blade of Mikula were the first bosses on the list. Rot helped a lot in Moog's fight. I was really surprised to see that Melania could be rotted. I can only assume that we can rot her because it's different compared to the rot that she's afflicted with. Hers comes from the curse of an outer god, but I'm sure someone down below can answer that better than me. Regardless, it was really cool to do and to learn something new. Next was Rykard, Regal Ancestor Spirit, and Valiant Gargoyles. I mentioned in the rules section that I wanted to test Rykard's fight with no armor, since this was always troublesome whenever I was doing a melee build. Well, it turns out that you can actually beat him with no armor and being up close. To explain my build, I used a talisman slot to heal myself constantly, alongside a mixed flask component that did the same. This was used in synergy with Melania's Great Rune to make sure that I can stay in the fight as long as possible. Besides that, I was just doing, damage resistance and stamina regen. Regal Ancestor Spirit is such a weird boss because it's placed in a mid to end game zone, but then has a very small health pool. Because the player gets here usually mid to late game, they are fairly leveled and have an upgraded weapon. So yeah, this was a cakewalk. Lastly, Valiant Gargoyles. These guys can't be rotted, but they have a medium sized health pool, and since there's two of them, it can be a little bit tricky. The last bosses in the main game gauntlet were Dragon Lord Placidusax, Estelle Natural Born of the Void, and Lich Dragon Fortisax. Placi is easily my favorite of the three, and I always enjoy his fight. I'll never forget the first time I fought him, and I was caught extremely off guard that this massive dragon could vanish into thin air, teleport around. Needless to say, I learned his moves really quick. Rot was more useful for Placi and Fortisax, especially since these guys like to do a bunch of flying attacks where I can't physically damage them. Ultimately, we take down all of these main game remembrance bosses and found that Rot is extremely useful. Now the question is, will this hold up in the DLC? Let's find out together. Entering the Realm of Shadows, we progress through Bellerot Tower Settlement and into Divine Beast Arena. This boss is a roll of the dice in terms of how difficult he can be. Some days he is the easiest thing, and then others he just feels harder than Radahn. Obviously he isn't, but damn, that lightning phase is super annoying to deal with, and especially as a melee user, it's near impossible to safely get hits in. After some time though, we take the beast down. Advancing to Castle Anesis, we take on one of the cooler DLC bosses, which is Relana Twin Moon Knight. For those DS3 players, I'm sure it was a hype moment when you got to this point in the DLC. She shares a lot in common with Pontiff Sullivan, who is a DS3 boss. They both use dual swords and can be parried into oblivion. Because we took down Relana, we can progress into the Shadow Keep and take down the bosses inside and around it. Within the keep, we find Mesmer the Impaler. Outside, we find Commander Gaius alongside Erdtree Avatar. Lastly, exiting the keep and progressing not too far to Ra Ruins, we find Ramna, Saint of the Bud. Rot helped a bunch in these fights, and the overall damage it dealt was insane, since these bosses have insanely high health bars. Though the exception was Ramna, since she can't be rotted. I was surprised that Melania could be rotted, then Ramna couldn't be, but what can you do? By this point in the game, we have grabbed nearly all of the Scarlet Rot weapons, though there were two weapons I didn't grab, since these had to be farmed from the Haligtree, and so yeah, we aren't going to do that. Now these weapons I'm sure would be fun to use, but the time investment wasn't worth it in my opinion. Branching out from the northern section of the DLC, I ventured south. Eventually we progressed up to Bale the Dread, Putrescent Knight, and Mother of Fingers. I really enjoy Bale's fight since it's action-packed and satisfying to punish his attacks, and reminds me a lot of the Dark Souls dragon bosses. The other bosses, while they are fun, are tedious to get to. Regardless, we take these fools down, so let's progress up to the last few remembrance boss fights. The second to last remembrance boss and my favorite DLC boss in this game is Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. After completing the Frenzied Flame ending in the main game and hearing about all the lore associated with the Three Fingers, Tribiri, Hyetta, etc. was super interesting to me and I'm sure many others. For me, this boss is peak From Software boss design, from the boss's attacks to the creepy and horror-esque design of Midra, and the eerie music playing during the boss fight is easily one of my favorites in the whole Souls series. Going to the top of Anir Lim, we find that Needle Knight Leda and her allies block the path ahead. Taking on the various NPCs, I found Rot to not be the most useful. Compared to at least Poison was a lot more useful, and I could proc it more often on these guys. This will be foreshadowed in the PvP. Last remembrance boss of the DLC and the game as a whole is Promise Consort Radahn. Similarly to his main game counterpart, they are both extremely vulnerable to Scarlet Rot. Using the buckler shield in one hand and the scorpion stinger in the other, we make this fool suffer. The dagger will give some nice critical damage. Since his damage boost is 110, then that's combined with the various talismans I'm using. Essentially, we do a fair amount of damage. Phase 2, Mikla will join the fight, assisting his brother. Infusing his holy attacks with Radahn's, we will have to make sure to be careful. The biggest thing I need to not do is get comboed by them, because dear god, I do not want to get my health bar deleted. Ultimately, we manage our stamina, heal at opportune times, and parry them over and over. Eventually, we take down a god and lord. This has been Elden Ring with Scarlet Rot Only. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. While the PvP matches are playing in the background, I will give my final thoughts on Rot in the main game and DLC, alongside its effectiveness in PvP. In the main game and DLC, I think Rot is an excellent choice for a status effect. I was able to play more cautiously with my movement and attacks, knowing that I was continually damaging the boss or various enemies. I was also surprised by how many enemies and bosses could be rotted. Now, it wasn't as many as Frost/Frostbite, but was still a ton. Next, let's talk about the PvP and the various weapons. The weapons compared to other status effects like Poison and even Madness, I found these weapons to be subpar. It's less noticeable in PvE, but PvP these weapons are just your standard weapons with Rot. Only one of them has that fancy Ash of War, which is Ramna's remembrance weapon. Now it's definitely possible to beat another player with standard weapons that have mediocre Ash of Wars, but generally in the Souls games, especially Elden Ring, the crazy insane attacks that the Ash of War causes generally deal insane damage and are great for PvP. I also didn't get a single Rot proc in PvP. It's interesting to see its effectiveness at the same level as Deathblight. I may not be the best player for PvP, but I'm far from the worst. So it was interesting to see that I couldn't even get a single one. Maybe others will find Rot to be super useful, but I don't buy it personally. Thank you for watching the video. Make sure to smash the like button, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Try to do something kind for someone today, whether it's a small or large gesture. And this is your boy Skilled Fawn, and I'm out.